basically one of the most important sessions in a way. This goes right to the very essence of what it is that we do, talking about sustainability and the like. So, and business models that support the work that you do. So Rashmi has kind of been a participant in our, particularly our online sessions over the last number of years, and she comes with an incredible wealth of experience and insight from within the Indian kind of lived experience. So it's a real privilege to have her here with us. It would be much better to have her here with us physically, but we're delighted that technology has helped to have her here with us. Maybe Rashmi, start off just by introducing yourself, what it is that you do, and then please proceed with your presentation.
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm quite honored to be here, and thank you to the Festivals Academy and Mike for involving me again, even though it's remote. I'm sorry I can't be here right now, but COVID has had a way of throwing up plans, Ori, and I hope we're able to see you all in person again. My name is Rashmi Dhanwani. I run the Artex company. It's a strategic consultancy in India. Cultural organizations on essentially how to articulate their value ecosystem within the culture sector, as well as other stakeholders. The way we do that is talking about value in three contexts. One in strategy and growth, the second in research, and the third in audience development. We have been working very closely with the culture sector here and with the community. So we do a lot of work around sector development, skilling, just bringing information and resources together. And one of the projects that we're working on at the moment is called Festivals from India. It's a digital portal that will showcase all of India's major arts and culture festivals. And it will also have information and resources for festival professionals to access opportunities, peer-reviewed, learning material from the culture sector in India and the region and South Asia. It's a UK-India collaboration, so there's a lot of resources from the UK as well. And that website will go live in about a month's time. But I'm going to launch into my presentation now. We are talking about sustainability of cultural festivals in time of COVID. I was a little conflicted about calling it COVID or post-COVID because different parts of the world are still somewhere in between the situation. But the interesting thing is that we have recently had some experiences of what a relatively post-COVID festival universe looks like. So I'll be bringing some of that into this conversation. Next slide. So first, to break down what we mean by sustainability. When we talk about sustainability, we talk about avoidance of the depletion of natural resources in order to maintain an ecological balance. Of course, sustainability has a core thought around the area of environment or ecological sustainability. But if you move the word ecology from here, it still applies to financial sustainability. We want to avoid the depletion of our financial resources in order to maintain a balance. So how do you look at the amount of resources that you have and manage it well, spend it at the right places so that the balance that you're able to maintain also is able to bring you long-term growth. And that is what we are going to be. So we're going to break down sustainability. When we talk about sustainability, what's at the core of sustainability and what is at the periphery of the notion of sustainability. So you've got all of these dimensions: environmental, cultural, business models, communities. And when we think of sustainability, even though we're talking about financial sustainability today, it'll be good to understand the universe of sustainability that we inhabit. So our value of sustainability cuts across some of these dimensions in totality. So at the back of your head, let's keep this in mind, but we'll deep dive into the next slide, which is essentially financial funding networks and business models, and how all of this will help us sort of look at a more robust financial sustainability model for our work in festivals. So much of this data that you're seeing right now is coming from a project that we've been running over the last 3 years called Festival Connections. It's a peer sharing platform for cultural professionals, mainly working in the festival space in India and the UK, to come together and talk about critical issues around festival management, administration, and growth. We have done so far about, I think this 18 has gone up. On last count, it's about 23 digital and physical events with the festivals community in India and with partners in actually South Africa, UK, and some in Europe as well. So we've had almost 70 festival directors, curators, speakers, sponsors speak about aspects of festival management and almost 2,000 attendees to these sessions. These are some of the sessions that we've held, and the insights that you are about to hear is emerging from this. So during COVID especially, we spoke about how do we cope with COVID, what about the conditions of gig workers, which is what a majority of the sector comprises of. What about digital futures? What do alternative revenue models look like? Health and safety. How do we take a step back and look at where we stand in terms of our current conditions? Pause and observe. So again, looking at how has COVID-19 impacted the funding of festivals. These are the priorities of festivals after talking to them that we've seen has been impacted. So what has gone up is footfalls and audience engagement expectations. So if it's digital, you need to have more people interacting with you, and how do they interact with you? Because in a physical context, it's their physical presence and their attention at the event is what is counted as one of the most important impact metrics. But in a hybrid context, the expectation context has widened as well. Of course, health and safety, you have to be more nimble in planning. And the insurance costs. The insurance cost is an interesting one. We were just having a conversation with one of our UK speakers a couple of months back, and they were telling us that the insurance schemes that are at play, they account for most of the losses that emerge out of cancellations because of COVID-19, but they don't account for losses that emerge out of artists canceling. So that, which tends to be a pretty significant cost when it comes to festival management. So just to keep in mind that even though your insurance costs have gone up, your cancellation costs also have to be accounted for in your planning. And what's actually depleted is arts has been lower on the priority list because health, safety, education has taken a larger prominence in priorities. Production costs, of course, have gone up. Profit margins have been narrowed down. There have been far more challenges when it comes to getting festival funding from brands as well at this time. And the ability to plan long-term has continued to face ongoing challenges, which we'll unpack a little more as we go along. These are some of the thoughts that came from the festival directors that we spoke to, one of whom, again, a testimony to what I've just shared, that standard operating procedures are difficult to implement given the amount of challenge that they're dealing with, and planning time has increased. So costs have increased across the board. Personnel, the costs have gone up 40 to 50% in conducting live events during the pandemic. And even if it's part digital, part hybrid. Another festival called Boomtown, Captain Barrett's from that festival told us about how much of the work that we are doing currently depends on the situation around COVID that we are still dealing with. So vaccines, availability of tests. So if you're having a physical event, COVID tests, quarantine challenges. So everything that goes into planning has just mushroomed, and this adds a significant layer of costs, and which also determines how can you go ahead with certain government-backed insurance schemes and what you can manage with what you have as resources currently. This was from Ili Jafar of an organization called Kinetic based out of UK, who spoke about interaction with brands, and he spoke specifically about sponsorship, and in talking to brands, what are the directions that people are taking and the change within brands that they are seeing, and how brands measure ROI or return on investment. So what number of organic and earned views, what is the brand tonality and score, and footfalls and quality of festival experience is what they are looking for at the moment. Jobin Matthew, who's from a big sponsor in India that sponsors a lot of street art with this large festival called Street Art Festival, and works very closely with the government. When we asked him about what makes sense for them in this current times, so they are talking about that they're looking for a sense of responsibility. So that having that sort of optics in play is a very critical dimension of their support for sponsorship. So they said, even though everybody says you should take a pause and reflect, for us, we could not take a pause. We had to take a stand about where we stand. And as a brand, people will forget us. So we had to continue moving as well. So what are the new business and partnership models around sustainability? Some examples, and I'm going to give you some updates around this as well. Starting your own platform. This is NH7 Insider. It's one of the largest music festivals in the country. In 2020, they had a digital version of the festival. 2021, they canceled. 2022, they were going to have a physical version, which they had to cancel because of Omicron, and now it's gone back. How can you renegotiate your festival experience with your funder? This was Jaipur Literature Festival is one of the largest literature festivals in South Asia. And they have, I was just telling Inga earlier today, they have 9 editions across the world. most of whom went digital over the last 2 years. And they had significant viewership online that increased sponsor confidence. This year, they've had a hybrid version with a 5-day on-ground festival and a 10-day digital festival in Jaipur. This was just a few days ago. However, the festival was originally supposed to happen in January and got pushed to March because of Omicron. I'll come to the losses that they faced because of that as well. How can you collaborate with relevant partners so that some of the baggage that you're working with can be balanced out? This was a theatre festival in Bangalore, Rangashankara, that played both pre-recorded shows as well as streamed some live shows with their ticketing partner. And how can you change your model of how do you deliver festivals in its entirety? So this is an example of Serendipity Arts Festival that had a completely digital virtual platform for each curated project that they curated through the year and held a lot of sessions within the year with significant audiences to give them a sense of what the work has gone on. So it's a complete replacement of the physical model, keeping in mind the internet as a site. I'm going to run over this very quickly, but it will be great for you to take a look at it at a later point. But just a sort of a contingency thought process when it comes to financial modeling of your festival during crisis. So survive, plan, and then sort of play. Like, how do you reorient your work across these? So in survival, you have to look at contingency planning, having your reserves and activation. How can you think about what areas you can save and what areas you should absolutely spend on? In the planning phase, how can you reorient your teams and split them into two priority areas? One is survival, one is thriving, so that you can move people in the directions that they should be moving in. Collaboration became a very important part of the replanning. And finally, play. How do you go out into the festival zone in the physical space? When I say physical, I mean going live, physical or digital. And how can you work with different kinds of financial thinking projections to be able to not just look at how to save, but also how to use learnings from your previous years in order to create newer and newer models, and have small, sort of experiments that help you grow newer ways of engaging with your audience as well. And finally, trust your audience to find you and your cultural niche. If there is loyalty, if they trust you, there's credibility, they will come back to you. Just a couple of more slides. This is on losses. This is, as I was mentioning, what the organizations have dealt with, particularly with Omicron, what they could navigate. So they mentioned that venues had become, and sponsors had become much more open to these concerns around COVID. So they were able to navigate some of these cancellation costs or slightly increased budgets or stretching of budgets because of Omicron. Production and planning was a little more manageable and navigable. People understood that cancellations are not something in their hands anymore. Insurance schemes, of course, kicked in for that time, but what can't be recouped? And this is a very important thing to acknowledge, because whether we like it or not, COVID is going to create some losses. So marketing costs, all of the money that was spent on billboards and ads and all of the outreach and personnel costs for that duration could not be recouped. You dealt with some amount of lesser footfalls for a physical event, especially if it was cancelled and moved. The internal team exhaustion, sustainability is also about sustainability of motivation and team members, and how do you deal with that, and how can that be recouped? So that was a massive challenge that festivals told us about over the last 3 months as they've been emerging from Omicron and reorienting their work. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, artist fees and booking, which is something a lot of insurance schemes do not include in their policies. This is something, again, I would suggest that you look at after the presentation. We'll share this with you. How do you look at key challenges to monetizing and distributing online festivals? There's a cycle of monetization where you look at the revenue models, the actual production, and what audiences value. Some thoughts from our speakers at Festival Connections of what they spoke about when it comes to digital events and festivals, and how can that be attuned for the times that we live in, and the cycle of distribution. So one is cycle of how do you think of monetization, keeping in mind production, and then when you're distributing it, how do you keep in mind how it can impact different stakeholders and different dimensions of distribution, and account for those in your planning. This was an interesting one that, there's always this battle between digital and live. And I wanted us to sort of, go away with this thought that let's not think of, one against the other, but them coming together and seeing what opportunities both of them present. While it can't be equated to live, if we are And controversial statement, heads up, but if we think that we're going to get back to 100% live and we'll never have to go back to digital, that's not going to happen. People's habits have changed, their expectations have changed, their motivations have changed. Keeping all of that in mind, if we do not move ahead with our business model evolution confidently, keeping in mind both the benefits and the cons of the digital experience, we will not be able to, I would say, thrive at the very least. If survive, we might, but thrive in the new post-COVID world is something for us we really need to think about to evolve our business models. Again, we'll leave this with you. This was a graphic visualization of what some of our speakers said about what do you need to stay alive or be resilient as a cultural festival or a professional. And this brings me back to the notion of sustainability. You can't think about financial sustainability without thinking about different dimensions of sustainability. So again, while talking about finance, let's also talk about that. A little bit about what we've been doing over the last 6-7 months since the second wave in India at least moved up. So some a sense of some workshops that we've done on festival audiences. It was digital audiences. So how do you look at data from in a digital context? Eco-friendly festivals, because we know that given COVID and the amount of wastage that we are dealing with, there's a lot of issues with how the battles that we've lost with environment sustainability over the last 2 years. We have to look that back. What does a new wave look like? What I will share with you is a protocol document we developed after Omicron to share with festivals about how do you prepare for any other eventuality that comes, right? Pitch Right, which is a workshop that we are having. We just had, a few days ago, and equality, diversity, and inclusion, which is, thinking of making festivals and festival organizations more diverse and inclusive. And finally, a little bit of the coming soon page for our Festivals from India, the portal that I was talking about. It'll be launched on the 20th, so we'll share the link with you then. And finally, in case you want to get in touch with us, those are our contact details, and I look forward to having this conversation with you all. That's it from me. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rashmi. And all the more reason why it's such a pity that you're not here with us, because I think, there's just such a richness and wealth of experience within the Indian kind of festival practice that we would be able to benefit from. And in many ways, your context kind of equates with many contexts that we are speaking to here on the African continent as well. So next time, hopefully it's not going to be in a global north country, but somewhere in the global south, we'll have you present with us. But thank you for sharing that, and I really would like to encourage you to get onto their mailing list and to receive their regular kind of updates, because there's some really important information that comes across. We're going to move on to Faisal.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, my name is Faisal.
Sorry, I was just going to say for Rashmi, if you could introduce yourself so she knows your status here.
Oh, hi, Rashmi. I'm Faisal. I'm an alumni of the Academy as well, like you. And I work with Bayimba Foundation, and we are the host of the Atelier. So I'm very grateful to have you join us on Zoom, and also to have all these amazing guys here. Yeah, so I can start. Yeah, so I'm very, really, fortunate to join the panel to talk about this topic, because for me, it means a lot, and from a very different context. As a Ugandan, and as an entrepreneur and an arts manager, and also a scholar of culture and arts and, sustainability, but also a nationalist who, not like an extreme nationalist, but a nationalist who always wishes good and try to be inspired and bring back home what I see or what I find, relevant and interesting. I've always been worried about where the future lies for the kind of work we're doing, where the future lies for the festivals that we have invested in. And I'm always very aware that differently, but also thoughtful, that if we don't plan now, then the work that we have invested in will be lost. And how do we need to plan now in the environment that we work in? It's not very conducive. We know that there's no government support. There's very little understanding of the context of culture, the value, the festivals that we are spending on, and how are we going to be able to sustain when the environment and the people and the culture is not really on board. So we thought that for our sustainability, for our survival, for our future, live around COVID was just yesterday. I think we've been in COVID situation since I don't know for how long. So we've been surviving, we've been inventing ourselves, we've been trying to be relevant, important, contributive. So we thought that for us to be able to survive, we needed to think beyond and to be able to predict kind of the future that we want to see. And we thought that we need to invest in a number of things for us to be sustainable. First, we needed to invest in the artists, in the content that we need to continue producing and presenting our work or to continue programming our festivals. We needed to invest in space. And this is very important because when we have conversations about space, it always sometimes triggers different notions. People already think like, oh, why do you need space? Culture centers are closing in Europe because of funding. There's no money. Why do you need to build a new space? Why are you buying land? How are you going to manage it? And I said, okay, I understand, but spaces in Europe and spaces here, they are totally different things. So we have to understand, for me to be able to continue to do what I'm doing, I needed to have space so that I have the freedom. I have the freedom to present. I have the freedom to assist others to create. I have the freedom to be able to do whatever I want whenever I want it. So, and this experience came in when I was working when I was holding our festival at the National Theatre. I always worked at the mercy of government because it's a government space. So whenever Parliament is, if someone has died and they need to do a meeting immediately, you cannot do anything. It's closed. So if you've planned, you've invested, you've programmed, you've bought tickets for people, you've booked hotels, it's over, Then you go back to it's a loss that they don't even want to know. No one, whom are you going to talk to? That, hey guys, I have an event here, and they don't want to listen. So for me to have the freedom, and that was for me to invest in my own space. So for me, sustainability has always been all around things. There was one thing I always talk about, and sustainability in terms of information, in terms of communication. One thing I realized in 2009, when I just started my festival, was that the media had no idea how to report about our work. And it was embarrassing to have a festival that you've invested in, and then you read an article in the morning in the newspaper that is really depressing. So there would be no interest for anyone to invest in what we are doing. So I said, what can we do? We need to teach these people how to write about the arts. So for 6 years, we invested in arts journalism. We could bring the best writers on the arts from South Africa, from the UK, from New Zealand, to come and teach our arts journalists how to write about art. And the conversation has changed. And I realized that now, there are too many things that are good about it. One, they can't write anything bad about me, because I told them. And two, I think they have also learned to be like, oh, wait a minute. If we write bad, then Faisal will be like, why did I spend money on you? So there's always something that they make an effort to write good things about whatever it's not only about Bayimba, but anything that they attend. And yesterday I saw some of them at the event where we are, and I'm sure I'm looking forward to the articles that will come out. So I'll send you the copies when you see. So there's a change, and that has really helped to not only for them to understand, to be proud of what they're doing, but also for the communities, for the audiences, for the readers who read these articles. They feel like there's something important or something good that they're reading. So for us, sustainability has always been about so many things: changing the environment, changing the culture, contributing. And I always say we are not changing, but we are contributing to the new, paving a way for the new generation that will come after us to be able to start somewhere. We put a stone, then the next person puts a stone. And also, coming back to COVID, what we've learned is that we were not prepared. We were not prepared for whatever shock that we got into. And everyone was not prepared. The governments were not prepared. Every discipline was not prepared, leave alone the essential workers, but we were not prepared, and we were caught so off guard that we didn't know what to do. So we were spending time at home in the first 2 weeks of COVID, and we were like, okay, this is going to be a nice time. We're gonna stay home. And then it got into the 4th week. And luckily, we got into 2 years in Uganda. So after 2 years, we were like, oh my God, we have been here for 2 years and they just passed by. We've done nothing. So we realized that we've gone back to zero. All the investments that we've done, all the small projects that we are going, all the money that we lost because of projects that we could not do were really lost. So how have we gotten into this situation? And we found that we were mentally unbalanced. And for me, one of the questions I've been asking myself all through the COVID time, what is my relevance as a programmer, as an entrepreneur? If artists are suffering, if the industry is has nothing to survive on, what has been my relevancy over all these 10 years I've been working? And I'm still working on that. Thank you.
I'm going to cheat and just play a video, yay, and then show you a little bit about how the word everyone hates is called pivoted. But before we show the video, I'll tell you some insights around Afropunk was always online before COVID, right? Because it's an international collective, and I've come to realize a lot of you don't know who Afropunk is, what it stands for, which is why I've asked for the video to be played first so that you can see what it's about. So because we were working on international teams, there was already a format for hopping on a Zoom call at a specific time and how they were running the festival. At the time of COVID, they also sold Afropunk to new investors pretty much around March when it hit. And so 40 young kids globally were fired overnight. And in America, you don't have the human rights laws we have in South Africa. And in South Africa, we had contractors who didn't have the rights and couldn't claim the funding anyway. So for me, the crisis was, here's this organization who's set up to create empowerment opportunities for the future makers, right? Our leaders in creativity, young black kids driving the future. The vision was to drive a new world order from Africa around a set of values. Start in Africa and going to the rest of Europe and going to the rest of the world. That was the idea. So when these kids were fired, and the people that bought the festival are black people, black billionaires, for me, I had a crisis of what am I doing this for? Because I've sat and listened to these people I look up to talk about creating black legacy businesses, looking after young black youth. How do you fire 40 young kids as COVID hits? Like, where is the duty of responsibility to profit versus the festival? So my job is money, and I was effective at it, so kept my job because fortunately money hit the bank account the day before they fired people, literally. And so I was a team of 6 people globally who converted Afropunk into something called Planet Afropunk. And they worked with some of the best tech people in the world, so color was not an issue. And it was about creating a model where we could platform artists. The narrative was to platform black young talent from around Africa and create opportunities. I'm saying narrative for a reason, because COVID taught me that capitalism and colonialism doesn't have color, it's just about profit. And so part of the heartbreaking experience for me is that I did manage to convince South African brands during COVID to invest in particular young black female artists and big money, because I phoned up friends I've worked with for 15 years to say, now is not the time for you to not be spending money. I know you can't sell alcohol because there was a ban on alcohol, right? And everybody stopped spending money. But I was like, now is the time to build your consumer market. Because if you're going to sit back and not create jobs, by the time COVID ends, ain't nobody going to buy your drinks, friend. You're never, ever going to recover in the market. So financially, there was an argument for people. But the second part to the argument was, if you do not step in and ask people right now who are absolutely on their knees suffering how you can be of value, you will never catch up your brand equity. If you sit back, right, and think you're going to come back after COVID, and then try and talk to people who are on the verge of death because they lost their jobs, you can forget it. You'll never, ever catch up. And that was a narrative that resonated for brands, because the truth is, You've got your Johnny Walkers competing with your Pernod Ricards, competing with global brands who really do have a lot of money. And the narrative makes sense. Make sure you keep people employed so they can buy your stuff. And make sure that people love you by asking them what they need, right? And what people needed were jobs. And so we were able to convert a lot of the brand money into a content space. So content is about creating really sexy, cutting edge, comparable with America, but not with white people shooting people. Doesn't even happen in America, I went. But anyway, the point is really dynamic content is what people are looking for. And so we were able to get brands to get behind creating beautiful content in the arts that they presented. So it was like Art and Times featuring 4 beautiful South African women artists in conversation, shot in conversation, and then they got social media coverage, they got the content, and then during this mass performance online, there were breakaway conversations and snippets of video that had been pre-recorded that allowed us to introduce the arts into it. If it were 100% effective, you should have been able to buy the art, and there should have been a marketplace, but we were all scrambling. The other thing we learned during COVID is that streaming doesn't work, and artists don't want to look like idiots online. And so we set up teams that sent out almost like a green screen pack to Brazil and different places in Africa, and they allocated a budget, and so your top talent performed their own music video, which became part of a lineup online. But it appeared as if it were live, right? Because you curated. There's this band, Anderson .Paak, hypothetically, performing. It looks like real life because you've curated an entire show. Then they breakaway conversations. Then you include chats on the side. So the big discussion was, how do you make people feel engaged? The reality is, because I look at the statistics, because I'm accountable for real reach, as you were speaking about impressions, audience engagement, the truth is nobody watched anything online. People didn't have the attention span or the bandwidth, and there was too much competition going on. So while there were these massive shows with this massive investment, if you look at the actual people online and for how long they were online, didn't equate to the investment. And certainly, if those were your measurables, I can tell you for real, they weren't there. The analytics will tell you that the people weren't there, right? It's called, there's a special term for how you get, people were depressed and exhausted about being online. It didn't engage people. Even conversations online were not connecting people. It was valuable if you could sit down in a room with people that you never got access to, like ministers of tourism. But you certainly, you know, just having conversations about how depressed you are because you don't have money and mental health, it's like, I'm over it. Yes, I'm depressed, now what? So from a brand point of view, you're able to take all the problems that were created and create content solutions, and they invested in it. Mental health programs, how do we make that sexy? How do we solve the problem? How do we engage the community? How do we talk about those kind of issues, right? So content is really what it was about. What does that mean? Oh, thank God. I thought I was doing something wrong. So the point is that online is fine, but it doesn't really work. And the other reality is that if you're going, no, I'm being real, hybrid festivals are cool but boring, quite frankly. And the only one that was very, very, very successful, that beat everybody to the post, was Tomorrowland. And the reason they were successful is they built the same size stage as they did in real life, and the rest of us made minute stages, right? So because Tomorrowland recreated the mass experience of what Tomorrowland was about, and they created packages that you could order in advance and have little parties with your friends at Tomorrowland, financially they were successful. They beat everybody to the marketplace, and nobody else invested that kind of money. That's the truth, right? The rest of the models that I don't think worked, in my personal opinion. And I was on lots of talks. And my attention span was like, okay, I'm over it. So what did that teach us? It teaches us that people need human connection. The world got depressed. Everybody got depressed. Those that could afford to went on to antidepressants. Medical aids made a fortune of money. Drugs increased, alcoholism increased, gender-based violence increased because people were stuck in their own homes. people in poorer areas never had masks, never mind access to hybrid festivals, and didn't care about vaccines and COVID. So that's the analysis of what COVID did, right? But I'll show you a video of what Afropunk is and how we managed to work with allies. So when I say allies, I'm talking brand managers who I phone up and say, come on, sister, we can change the world. I know you've got access to money. Let's do this together. And she's like, cool, this is how much money I've got. I'm like, excellent. Why don't you own the art and times?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to stand here because I'm going to be pointing to aspects of the presentation, and context really matters. And I'm really grateful to the ways in which Faisal and Sharon have spoken to the kind of range of contexts in which we work. And I'm going to invite everyone to think about how the business model that I had to try to innovate for sustainability as a festival manager could apply in your context. This is the intersection of two main roads in an agricultural town in sort of southwestern South Africa called Witwatersrand. It's the center of the world's ostrich industry. It has a festival economy. And once a year, for 10 days, we closed the intersection in the town. Next slide, please. That intersection that you see there is that intersection there, and the whole town became overrun by about 40,000 visitors from out of town to participate in a multidisciplinary festival, theater, music, dance, galleries, film, etc., but in a language with a lot of baggage. And that is the language called Afrikaans. In Dutch, it literally means African. It's the Creole that emerged at the colony at the Cape in between the 17th and the 19th centuries. And there's an irony that the word in Afrikaans that most people in the world know is apartheid, or separateness, because in fact this is a language of convergence and togetherness. It involves fusions of European and various indigenous African languages. And so in the post-apartheid context, we had the challenge of trying to work with the energies of the people who gathered around this festival, who came from many different backgrounds, but I was fascinated by the ways in which local grassroots culture spoke to the aspects of that history that had been erased by apartheid. And we're looking at what are called roosterkoek in South Africa. And I don't know if many of my South African colleagues here know that roosterkoek is an example of pre-colonial cuisine. Khoi and San peoples in the rural Western Cape, these are First Peoples, used to make this kind of bread in the fire with indigenous grains before colonialism. And it became a symbol for me about the ways in which one could curate a festival in the Afrikaans language that could recover a creolized history of encounter and collaboration to try and shift the national narrative and the place of the Afrikaans language in an avowedly post-apartheid South Africa. So that was the premise of the festival. When Mandela came to the festival early in its history, he came precisely because at the moment of transition in the country, there was a sense of needing to find a new narrative for the ways in which we inherited basically apartheid culture. And so the premise of the festival was to try and transform the place of the Afrikaans language in South Africa. Afrikaans had been the language that had been imposed on youth in places like Soweto and had actually ignited the 1976 uprisings in South Africa. How does one turn a language of oppression into a language of creativity and sharing and blackness? Because this is actually part of its history. So by the time I inherited the festival, which was by its 13th edition, its founders had left, and there was a need for a new vision and a revisiting of fundamental premises. Many of us are speaking at this Festival Academy about startup festivals, but one learns a lot by having to inherit a festival and steward it, but renew, in other words, refresh its reason for existing. And so a conversation about sustainability for me has to start from that fundamental reason for the festival. What compelling reason exists for this festival to happen now And it can't stay static. It needs to speak to the moment. So I inherited a very difficult challenge because this festival had been so commercially successful, it had grown into South Africa's largest festival. It was selling more tickets than the National Arts Festival in South Africa, but it was being copied by many other rural festivals that were starting to look really generic, and it was playing to the historically white audiences that we were precisely trying to transform. And there was a lot of corporate money trying to chase that retention market. And I needed to not only transform the content of the festival, but transform its funding base. But I had to do so in a sustainable way. One of the things that I did was pause and say, what's unique about where we are? This festival happens in an extraordinary landscape with an extraordinary pre-colonial history. And if one puts one's work in the landscape and engenders a relationship with the place and the people of the place. This is an ostrich farm outside Witwatersrand, and I started working deliberately with the landscape, with that agricultural community, to make the kinds of theater that you could only experience in that landscape. And during this theater piece, which was about a kind of creation myth, you get an amazing co-director when you work in the landscape. Lightning struck the mountain behind and started a fire on the landscape. People remember moments like that because they're irreplaceable and non-generic. Now, how does one sustain this? I was fascinated about working with ostrich farm workers. We had an extraordinary local artist work with farm workers who know ostriches and turn these into a presence in festivals that were invited to other events. And symbolically, the next slide was about taking something that was associated with an often feudal agricultural economy and turn it into a symbol of flight and imagination. So, how does one do this kind of work from a business model point of view? Also, the kind of thing you can do when you work with local community, accessing indigenous story. I'm going to talk about festival ecologies, in other words, systems that feed each other. And notice how Faisal spoke about how important it was to think about who's telling stories about your festival. I'm going to talk about a festival as a pyramid. And I got the job because I was an arts manager and I could work with commissioning new productions. But there was a huge entertainment component to my festival. There were commercial stages, there were pop-up comedy stages in bars. And then in a rural agricultural setting in South Africa, there were tens of thousands of local people who came out of their homes onto the streets, who were basically spectators of the entertainment and arts programs. And how do you work with that social distance in a vision for social sustainability? Because otherwise, your festival is going to play out the inequalities in your host society, which, as Mike has told us, are the most extreme in the world. So I often used to say that the distance from Witwatersrand to Cape Town and Waterkloof in Pretoria was less than the distance from downtown Witwatersrand to the township, to the farms, because the arts had deliberately been taken out of Black education by the apartheid system, and it was my job to try and bridge that gap. So how do you work with this as a business model? I realized that if I was going to sustainably produce new arts that spoke to my non-racial vision of Afrikaans, and I wanted to involve the local community, too many people at my festival were chasing the money here. But if I could control that money, I could myself cross-subsidize the vision that I have. Now, there's a theoretical basis for this on the next slide, please. There's a classic audience development pyramid that Morris, Hargreaves, and McIntyre, which is a consultancy in Manchester, who's consulted for all the big cultural organizations around the world. And they speak about a really useful way of thinking about your audiences. Lots of what we tend to do is be speaking to the most loyal people who already come to our festivals. But in fact, there's this group called Open to Persuasion who's never been. And they're people at the bottom of the pyramid who actually actively resist going. And in South Africa, I knew there were more potential audiences that I could grow than focus my attention on keeping the older, mostly white audience that I needed to plan for succession for. And in South Africa, because of the history of Afrikaans, I needed to be telling people nationally what transformative potential there was in the place of Afrikaans if we could center the experience of the majority of South Africans, most of whom in rural South Africa speak Afrikaans as their second language, but it's a language of blackness, not whiteness. So think about how this might pertain to you. What I had to do basically was start deliberately cultivating my audiences of the future that I didn't yet have. And I would spend more time working on my audience for 5 years while I was keeping my present audience and trying to take enough of them along with me to believe in that new vision. So thinking about your audience as not just one thing, but in fact deliberately planning for the future and festival by festival seeding that. So that's what I have to share. Thank you.
That's really excellent, Brett. It's probably the first festival model that is based on a pyramid scheme.
I may go. I have a presentation as well, which has some slides and a video. I'd like to start off by agreeing with everything everyone's said so far, but particularly I want to start with the analysis that Brett just made of festivals and about the fact that they are specific. And I'd like to say the situation that I inherited in Perth, which is the most remote city on earth. It's the oldest festival in Australia, 60 years old at that time. It was, so the custodianship of that festival was vitally important. And everything you talked about, site-specificness, the nature of the people, if you change the word ostrich to kangaroo or emu, if you change the traditional custodians of the land to indigenous people, if you change all those things, all those stories were the same. So I arrived in 2012 and had 4 years there. And in my first year, we opened with a big outdoor event. And it was a huge success. 30,000 people came. It was fantastic. And people said the words that I now fear more than anything, how will you follow that? And I want to talk about almost the most unsustainable festival model, which is crazy success. The moment when you do something that actually just catches the imagination. And what I didn't want to run was this. And I can share this slide with you. So it's yet another music festival at a really inconvenient location. An 80s band. There's you torrented the last album but forgot the name. The only actual artist on here, hilariously, is Kendrick Lamar, because he was at every festival. Anyway, that's what I didn't want to run. I didn't want to run that. And I'll share that because it's hilarious. But I went to a place that had a storytelling tradition of 40,000 years. And if they were here now, they would fight everyone in the room to say that they are the longest standing oral tradition. But I've realized I'm not going to say that unless they're with me. But that was vital. And the opening event of my first festival was on the beach at dawn with a choir of a couple of hundred people singing a new adaptation of a traditional song. And this was the event that everyone said amazing. It was 2 tons of feathers raining down onto the audience while angels arrived from heaven to land where they would arrive from heaven if they returned to earth, which is obviously the city centre of Perth, just outside the town hall. And yeah, people loved it. We made it about them, not us. We didn't say, aren't we great? We said, look at the people having a fantastic time. And so I realized in that time we had a few stories. I apologize for my back, Brett. Sorry. We had a few stories we really wanted to tell, and we would have the biggest success if we were specific. One of them was, it was about to be 100 years since the end of the First World War, and obviously Gallipoli was the moment at which Australian and Anzac and New Zealand soldiers fought for the first time under their own flag, not the British flag. So in effect, it's perceived as nationhood. That's number one. Number two, it was 7 years since the government in Australia had apologized to the Aboriginal people for attempting but failing a genocide, in effect, when they first came to the land. We also wanted to tell that story that Perth is brilliant and wonderful and remote, but if you're a young kid in rural Perth or rural Western Australia, you feel like you want to be in Sydney or London or New York, but actually you are where you are, and that is fabulous. So I wanted to do all of that, and for me there was only really one company in the world that can do all of that, and that's Royal Deluxe, who are a company from France. I now disagree with myself, by the way, on this entirely, but at the time, Royal Deluxe have these extraordinary giants. They are kind of between 10 and 14 meters tall. They're operated by marionettes, or humans operate them like marionettes. So these guys, there are 70 on the giant diver and 30 on the giant girl. They move the legs by jumping off and pulling ropes, and the legs lift. This is a picture of what we eventually do in the streets. We had 1.4 million people come and see the show over 3 days. And the reason I didn't mention this at the beginning of the Atelier, as I said to Mike, is because it's one of those things that's daunting. I watch it, and this feels so 10 years ago, and and nothing. This is ridiculous now.
More than 500,000 people have packed the city to watch the Giants.
Sam, this is street art at its most creative.
There was little space on the footpath.
And it's the biggest event of its kind Perth has ever seen.
While it stretched the transport network and pushed the city to its limits.
There are people as far as the eye can see.
Crowds never before seen in the city have gathered to get a glimpse.
Perth's in the grip of giant fever tonight.
A wonderful start to the Perth International Arts Festival.
One thing is obvious, nothing has ever captured the imagination of Perth quite like these giants. As you can see, it caught the imagination. It was huge. The crowds were kind of larger than we expected. The key to it was always the storytelling. The little girl giant had a right, and the story was a bit crazy. But the little girl had come from space into the indigenous communities and walked over 100 years to Perth to meet the diver giant who had gone down in Gallipoli attempting to save ships, walked across the seabed, and in that time became a giant tribe. So it was their reunion. We did it by saying we would make this about the First World War. So we had the Army, the Navy, Air Force, and the Return and Services League all at a massive outdoor event, which in itself was the biggest thing I've been involved in. That was just something more. On the Saturday, we had a smoking ceremony for the indigenous people who sang to the giants and welcomed the giants in front of 400,000 people. And we could foreground that story. And on Friday, we had children presenting a book of what they believe their city is and their world is. And looking back in hindsight, and it still makes me get wobbly watching it, it's interesting. The interesting thing was, as we were trying to get it together and do it, we had to raise $5.5 million Australian dollars, which is about €4 million, about, say, pounds and US dollars. And I haven't worked it out in Ugandan shillings, but billions possible. And so in that whole process, we had to be friends with everybody, and we had to retell the story, the same story, over and over again to every possible stakeholder. If the hotels said no, we couldn't close the city. If the transport system said no, we couldn't close the city. If the Return and Services League didn't say this is respectful about our legacy, and if the Army and if the Navy and the Air Force, and so we asked everyone, and what we ended up with was everybody saying, it's not a no from us, but you'll never get the fire department to say yes. And then the fire department would say, well, no, we're in. We're not against it, but you won't persuade the ambulance service. Ambulance service would say, the roads, no way. And so everybody said,
And we got to a point where we'd raised about 4.5 million of the 5.5 we needed. And we were told to stop. The general manager of the festival said, it's over, we can't do this anymore, we haven't got the permissions. And so I was asked to write a letter to say to everyone involved that we weren't doing it and that it wasn't going to be possible. And so I wrote a letter on a Friday, and it said, dear stakeholder, dear supporter, we would like to just say that we've come to the end, we believe we're coming to the end of the line with the Giants. We know it's expensive, we know it's major, and despite the fact that it will bring an economic impact of $45 million into the city, despite the fact that it will allow children to understand both Indigenous stories and Anzac stories, despite the fact it will allow the whole city to come together to mark both where we're coming from, where we are, and where we're going, despite the fact that it will have give everybody pictures, photographs, and stories for the rest of their lives and be transformational, despite the fact that for the people who fund it, we know that this would have been a moment of a lifetime in a way that also their children would remember them. And despite the fact that we know that if we turn this down now, it will go to Sydney, on the other side of the country, who we hate, who had it before us, but they let it go and we snapped it up. Despite all of those things, it's really clear that unless a miracle happens by next Tuesday, we will have to say we're not doing this event, which General Manager read it and didn't quite spot that's not, it's over. We've got about 2 days left. So, actually, could we go back a couple of slides to the newspaper one? So back one more. So on the Monday, which was West Australian Day, so the newspaper rang me and said, do you believe this is over? And I said, well, I believe in angels, which had been the first show we'd done in the festival. So everyone went, oh, nice, remember the angels. And you can print the picture. By the way, I should immediately say, I didn't think up any of this. My marketing manager, my PR manager, my technical, all of those people, brilliant people. As I said the other day, I've got 2 quotes that I live by. If you're dumb, surround yourself with smart people. If you're smart, surround yourself with smart people who disagree with you. That's Aaron Sorkin. And the other one is to buy more thongs, to write more happy songs. It always takes a little help from someone, Shakira. And those 2 live by that, yeah? So, the paper, front page of the paper, who will save this event? Thank you. It was a cheap applause, but I take it. And the next slide, this was the inside paper. And of course, within about an hour of this coming out, somebody had rung in and said, we can give you another $50,000, which isn't very much. But at this point, the Premier has to meet with us. So we have to meet with because we realized the one person we hadn't talked to was the head of government. We went and talked to the city and explained everything we would do for them. We explained all those things about economic impact. We were given a 3-minute slot with council. It had never been done for a cultural event ever. And we were there for half an hour when they questioned us. And then we left and I said, that's done. They're never going to do it. We had the Minister for Mining, the Minister for Sport, the Minister for Fighting in the Streets and being West Australian. And don't quote me on that bit. But it was nobody, there was no culture minister. But that point of, do you want to be the people who didn't do this? Do you want to be the politicians when hundreds of thousands of people come? And we made them the heroes. So by the end of it, they did actually find us a sponsor that wasn't an evil sponsor that time. And we did it. And so on the Friday night, all the children came. There's a story actually around the giant having to get over this bridge, which I will tell you separately, but it's the best health and safety story I've ever been involved in, and I love it, but I haven't got time. It was, we needed everybody. The police had to give their time and energy for free. Everybody had to donate. They had to shut the city voluntarily. So it had to not be about us, and it had to not be about me, but it also couldn't be about the artistic director of the company, who, after everything that's happened in the past few years, is problematic. And probably everything that's ever happened is problematic. As a human being. So anyway, we just run through the slides now, and that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. It was on the last day, we had 400,000 people come to see it. The Indigenous people said that it was the most seen and respected they'd ever felt, with one exception of 7 years ago to the day, which was a coincidence we didn't know, when the Prime Minister said sorry to the Indigenous people of Australia, and this was and they walked into, after this smoking ceremony, they walked into the dressing room and 400 members of staff and artists from all around, from France, stood up and applauded them, and they were just in tears because that's not how you get treated as a black fella in Perth. Anyway, so there were horses. There were horses, and there was a flyover by the army, by the Air Force. And that was the final day, which was the biggest crowd probably. And from here, as you'll see in the next slide, they went off and walked, and all these people followed them around. And that's the most scared I've ever been in my life, because it's ridiculous, because you can't control a body of people that big. And at the end, they all got onto a boat and sailed off down the river, where they travelled, I believe, back to Africa, where the little girl had originally come from. But really, they didn't. They went to Fremantle, and I'll tell you that story another time. But the newspaper did a very rare thing. Newspapers in Australia always say good and bad. Even the report that said, I love it, despite travel chaos, it was marvellous. But there's always a bad thing. And this is here for two reasons. One, for the first time ever, they did a double spread with it was a success, no question. And secondly, front page news, tomorrow, partly cloudy. And that's, it was 40 degrees. It was 40 degrees all the time we did it in the blazing sun. So hats on to the French. So the reason I'm showing this is because there is a moment in every negotiation when you simply go, it would be easier for you to say yes than for me to just carry on forever coming back to you. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. And actually, this slide, this is me and the Premier. And what I should say here is both the hands in that photograph belong to the Premier.
Okay.
But once you've seen it...
Jonathan, we actually can't show it because...
What? Yeah, so both hands belong to the Premier. That's not my hand, that's his hand.
Aside from the fact that I absolutely, I'm having massive feelings of FOMO right now, but no, there's some fantastic presentations. I actually have a few thoughts. I'll start from the last one first. Jonathan, Brett, what fantastic presentations. I think there was just so much to learn about. I mean, and we know that all it takes to make something of this sort happen, right? Like, especially at the scales that we are talking about, and how do you think of each of the stakeholders in different ways, and to not club them as a single category, but to understand what each of their needs are. And when you do that, you realize, as Jonathan was saying, like, they're okay, but someone else isn't, and someone else says, no, but I'm okay, but they aren't. And how it's, you know, when you start facing it, you sort of have a sense of, actually, it may not be that difficult. It just requires, perseverance and persistence. So that was some great learning emerging from there. And also at the same time, I think one of the things I thought of was where this notion of where does your value actually lie of what you're trying to create. And sometimes it's deliberate and sometimes it's accidental. And when you hit that, I wouldn't even call it sweet spot, that bullseye, things open up. You get that, $50,000 call, or you are able to get that 5% of your audience. I think there's a percentage that you say an audience is about, out of the 100% of your audience, it will be 3 to 5% that's your core audience, and that pays the least, but are the largest influencers, and they are the ones who actually get the other 95% to pay and come. So just understanding where your actual value lies, and money is actually a symptom or an outcome of touching that value bullseye, so to speak. I also thought Sharon's presentation, I mean, the 2 points, Sharon, that you spoke about, one was convincing brands, the two narratives that, that now is the job to stay present. And the second is, if you can't tell people what they need now, you will never catch up. I thought both of those points were very astute, and what also a lot of festivals and brands told us. I think I quoted in my presentation one of the brands, Asian Paints, who said exactly the same thing. So the interesting thing was that on the one hand, you were trying to exhort that narrative, but if a brand is smart, they are thinking of the same narrative. So for a change, that was a global sentiment that we could all respond to. So it was great to see that how that narrative was sort of continued across the world. And if you're able to, again, crack that narrative, you were able to sort of talk through sustainability, even in times of crisis when purse strings are shut. Where do you place or hit that value eye? And I think, Faisal, everything that you spoke about, your investment in artists and space, I think both of them were a very crucial set of points you raised. So one of the festivals that we've been talking to, called Serendipity Arts Festival, did exactly that. So this was a massive scale festival that happened in the state of Goa every year. And they had an incredible amount of audience coming in across 7-8 genres. So they had to put a pause to their festival, but that's exactly what they did. They focused back on artists and gave artists the room to create new work, especially in the digital realm around this time. And in terms of space, they've actually now decided to transition from, they will continue to hold the festival, but transition some of their funds into creating a new venue in their center city, which is Delhi. So it's kind of, again, interesting to see how that thought process, but also on the other side with arts journalism and investing in information. And I think that's another thing. How do you, with Jonathan as well, like what are your mechanisms to communicate that value to your stakeholders, whether it's what is coming in the newspapers or the messaging that's coming in the newspapers, or what is your role in enabling the creation of that message, whether it's through training programs. So these are some of my sort of synthesis points from what everyone's shared, and it was a real pleasure to listen to such diverse thoughts. Thank you so much.
Great, and yeah, thank you, Rashmi. We're going to say goodbye to you now, but yeah, just thank you so much for your contribution and for that great summing up. See you at the next one. Ciao.
Yes, lovely to meet you all, and good luck for the rest of the atelier for everyone.
Great, thank you.
Bye.
I think that, one of the things that the panel kind of also showed was the power of imagination. I mean, we often speak about ourselves as being in the different space to others, and that is because we are creative people. We have imaginations. We can think out the box. And I suppose that's the kind of encouraging thing to take away from this. It's about dreaming. And in a way, Jonathan's presentation tied up a whole bunch of things that have been happening over the last couple of days, like the presentations that you folk made yesterday, talking to the council for 3 minutes, making your pitch and it landing up a lot longer. Those are the kind of things.